The Retirement Cafe podcast. Take control of your brain health to prevent mental decline and dementia with Dr. Ben Webb. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Retirement Cafe podcast with me, your host, Justin King. If you're thinking about your retirement or already retired, you're in the right place. My aim is to help you plan for and live a successful and meaningful retirement. Retirement is far more than just a financial event. It's a significant life event, a major transition, which will bring with it new challenges and opportunities. So each episode contains tips, information, and inspiration to help you feel more informed and confident about your retirement. I hope you enjoy today's episode. Hello and welcome to this week's episode where I am excited to be joined by Dr. Ben Webb. Ben is a neuroscientist, psychology lecturer, speaker and author specialising in how the brain works. Ben has spent 20 years researching how the brain works, so he knows his stuff and now shares this knowledge via his podcast and courses to help us deepen our understanding of how the brain ages. His aim is to allow us to take control of our own brain health, and there's an amazing amount within our control. In our conversation, Ben shares the 6 pillars of a healthy brain in detail, including some interesting statistics about how the food we eat can reduce our mental decline by up to 30%. It's similar when it comes to the impact exercise can have, as well as how we manage stress, the critical role of good sleep, and how to build up cognitive reserves. I've chatted with many guests about what we can do physically to stay healthy into later life, but much less about what we can do to keep our brains healthy. This is a really rich conversation with so much insight. So without further ado, I hope you enjoy my conversation with Dr. Ben Webb and pick up some tips for a healthy brain. Welcome to the Retirement Cafe podcast, Dr. Ben Webb.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, Dustin. I'm really glad to be here.
Yeah, well, I've been really looking forward to chatting with you. For those who don't know you, let the audience know who you are and what you do.
So I'm a neuroscientist by training, kind of worked in scientific research for the best part of 20 years, studying how the brain works largely, and largely focusing on particularly the way the sort of brain changes in response to experience. That was sort of the focus of my research for many years. But I decided a couple of years ago now, to take some of that knowledge and try and bring it out into the wider world and try and help people, particularly people in midlife, who it's a kind of point in life where we often come to various junctures where your brain health in particular and your brain are very important. So I've tried to take that knowledge out to the sort of masses, so to speak, and try and help people with understanding their brains, their brain health, and specifically helping people to prevent mental decline and understand mental decline and prevent dementia as they age.
Yeah. Well, I can only imagine, I don't know every one of our audience personally, but I can imagine that, especially our clients that we deal with, that it is a concern. Obviously, their health as they get older is a concern to themselves. And, not obviously they can, I think people think that they can do quite a lot about their physical capabilities, We've had a lot of experts talking about, how we keep strong and our muscle wastage as we get older, and we go for walks and those types of things, and obviously eating well, which I think we're going to cover today as well. But it's a underlying fear, I think, of cognitive decline. It's like it's quite frightening. People don't really want to talk about it. They only really start talking about it when they start talking about maybe what's happened to their parents or their relatives. Yeah. So this is a great topic for us to be hearing about. So what can we do to prevent the declining brains as we get older?
Well, up until relatively recently, I guess, maybe 10, 15 years ago, I think science was showing there's not a lot that we can actually do. And unfortunately, there's been the sort of scientific world and the medical world moved in a particular direction in which it's kind of sadly ended up where we don't currently have, any medical interventions at all or drugs available or whatever that can actually help slow down or stop mental decline. But there was a movement, something that's, as I say, that's happened sort of 10, 15 years ago, which is part of the reason I left my original job to sort of take up, to explaining and getting this message out to people, is that there's a lot we can do now for our brain. So we call it our brain health. So essentially in the same way as our kind of physical health, ways in which we can improve the health, of our well-being. So it's a relatively new movement, relatively new sort of understanding. But so in terms of mental decline itself and things like dementia and, more specifically Alzheimer's, which is the most common form of dementia, sadly, actually, most of us, nearly all of us, will actually have, this is a really scary thing to say, but we'll actually have the disease, the pathology inside our brain already. So we already have it inside our brains in midlife. So in our 30s and 40s, it's already there. It's part of a kind of, comes out of a natural sort of biological process that we could discuss if we were interested in that. That's already there. That's not the issue. The issue is that that's there. The issue is whether, so that's the disease process, Alzheimer's itself, whether later in life that's going to manifest into symptoms, as you say, of cognitive decline and mental decline and memory loss. And it turns out, and this is where the real revolution has been in our understanding, is that whether or not that actually happens is actually within our control. And it's very much in our control in a lot like heart health or other aspects of physical health, in the diet and lifestyle that we have, that we have in our life generally. So those things are completely under our control. So it's that, and it turns out that those things, we can get into the specifics, of exactly what that looks like, but that can actually protect your brain. It provides this sort of buffer for your brain almost, where it prevents the disease from manifesting into these symptoms of cognitive decline and so on. And it's very much around, as I say, the diet and lifestyle that you live. And that's the thing that we're really, really understanding now. So all of the things that have happened in your life, the cumulative effects of, perhaps the experiences you've had early in life, the trauma, sadly, you might have had early in life, the different experiences and different events in your life that have accumulated, the inflammation in your brain that's accumulated up until this point, in the end, will either manifest or not later on. So, and when we can talk about the ways, if you'd like me to, about the ways in which we can go ahead to protect our brain from from mental decline.
Well, I think that's exactly what people want to know. They probably can't do anything about whether they had. I took your test, by the way, which I'm sure I'll refer to in a second, on your website earlier. And I've had your free report, which I would highly recommend to everybody. So we'll put the link in the show notes and we'll talk about that in a second. But one of your questions within that test, which is there to illustrate where you are with your brain health, was, have you had head trauma in the past? And I was thinking back to, what did I do? When I was at prep school, I boxed a little bit, but with gloves on, etc. And we didn't have those those helmet things,
guards.
Those guards that they wear nowadays. This was in the 70s, and then I played rugby for a few years until I got too small and got pummeled too many times. So came off the rugby pitch and then took up running. But then you look at other people who are. I mean, we've heard a lot about sports people, haven't we, recently, with head injuries, especially from rugby, that type of thing. And of course, boxers would have this significant, But I suppose most people listening probably haven't had those kind of head trauma issues, but they may have had other things from car accidents or what have you, or that type of thing. But of course, I suppose what I'm trying to get at is all those things have happened to us, but what we really want to know is, what do we do from here onwards? How do we impact our lives going forward? Because I can't do anything about being a 9-year-old boxer, but what I want to know is, what can I do going forward, which is going to help me protect me in my 50s, my 60s, my 70s, my 80s, and maybe even into my 90s.
Absolutely. So, I mean, you've highlighted a really good, important point there that, the risk factors, as we might call them or whatever, that have essentially gone before in your, existence up until this point. And head trauma is one of those. And there was a big study that looked at that specifically. So in rugby players, and other studies looked at it in football players, so heading the ball as well. And, other forms of head trauma. And it is a risk factor. And that really comes as this really sort of, there's what we call the sort of 6 pillars of brain health. There's really 6 different ways, that you can reduce your risk and the risk that you may have accumulated over your lifetime up until this point. And the first one is medical health. So that's the sort of most obvious in lots of ways, lots of those risk factors that we might talk about. And that includes things like reducing the factors that put you most at risk of developing Alzheimer's and dementia later on. So that's things like high blood pressure, which is much more common in midlife, and getting that down into kind of within the normal range. So diabetes as well turns out to be a really high risk factor. And that's largely because the brain is this sort of energy demanding, it's the most energy demanding organ in the body. It's only sort of a few percent of the body's weight, but demands 20% of the total energy. And it uses glucose to draw on that energy. So when people become insulin resistant and end up in a sort of diabetic situation, the brain isn't fueled properly. And that's the short version of that story. So that's why diabetes is also a risk factor. So getting your blood sugar under control and diabetes. Sadly, like for many chronic diseases, obesity is as well. And then there are other sort of mental health risk factors like depression, head trauma, as we mentioned, and smoking. So they're risk factors, but they're all modifiable risk factors that at this time of life you can get under control with medication and diet and lifestyle changes. And that brings me on to the second thing and it's probably the most important thing you can actually do for your brain health and reducing your risk of Alzheimer's and dementia later in life is the food you eat. And so that's actually what we call eating a brain healthy diet and a gut healthy diet as well. What that diet looks like, to encapsulate it simply, is very much a sort of Mediterranean style diet. So that's high in vegetables and fruits. So berries and high in green leafy vegetables and so on. So where half your plate is really full of vegetables, and low in sugar, salt, and processed food. So that's research proven now to. So, for example, a diet that includes cruciferous vegetables and green leafy vegetables like broccoli and kale and spinach and so on, those sort of, it reduces your chances of mental decline by up to about 30%. So it's a huge, and that's because the brain needs fuel, and it needs the right type of fuel and to exclude the wrong type of fuel. So that's where you want to reduce. So in the Western world, we're still very much have a diet that's high in sugar, salt, and processed foods. And these much more traditional diets, like the Mediterranean style diet, is the sort of diet that really is incredibly helpful for, we get into the specifics, if you like, for your brain health. So that's the first, that's, I would say, the most important thing that you can do. The third thing is actually, just like heart health, exactly the same, is actually an active lifestyle that incorporates regular movement into your daily routines. So obviously I mean exercise here, and that really is a safeguard against future dementia, but it also actually invigorates your kind of abilities to your clarity of thinking now, your reasoning, your memory, and so on in the here and now. And that's because, again, this is the last 10 or 15 years of understanding of the way in which this works is kind of as accelerated. And we now know that, so if we take, for example, aerobic exercise, that actually it supplies, first and foremost, it supplies your brain with constant and continuous blood flow containing carrying all of the nutrients and so on that your brain needs. But it does also these amazing other things as well, that it promotes these factors in your brain that promote the growth of new brain cells in exactly the brain areas that are affected by Alzheimer's and dementia. So this area in the brain called the hippocampus that's heavily affected, that's involved in your memory and learning, the most important part of your brain for your memory and learning. It's one of the areas that shrinks and is affected by the disease process in Alzheimer's and dementia. So this is one way to counter that process and provide a constant supply of new brain cells and connections between those brain cells in an area of the brain, even in the natural aging process, is naturally declining in those biological elements, but in the disease process of Alzheimer's is declining rapidly. And, so this is one way. So aerobic exercise specifically to counter that, but aerobic exercise coupled with what we might call resistance training as well. So, weights training, any kind of training which involves any sort of resistance. Again, relatively new research has shown that research proven to boost your brain in many different ways, including building the sort of scaffolding there that I've talked about of kind of new brain cells and connections between new brain cells. And it offers additional benefits in midlife as well, particularly for women, for strengthening the bones of muscles and often the osteoporosis that many people experience in midlife. And again, an important factor for as you get older, because that reduces your risk of trips and falls. Also a big risk factor for head trauma and other contributing factors for Alzheimer's and dementia. So the most important thing to sort of say about exercise is that often when people think about exercise, and in general, it's often you're thinking about perhaps getting your body into a good physique, toning up your body and so on. That's the purpose of sort of exercising for your brain, or activities for your brain aren't really, I mean, that could be a secondary consequence, but that's not the purpose of them, are to supply these nutrients and so on, and these elements that your brain needs. So often a lot of the exercises aren't quite, and this is certainly true absolutely for women specifically, but aren't quite as intensive as you might imagine for some of the exercises you might do to get in body shape. So for example, vigorous walking for 20 to 30 minutes every day. There's a big research study that showed that reduces your chances of mental decline by 30%. It's incredible. It's like, and just a simple exercise like that. So, and all of the evidence sort of suggests that, in simple terms, is regular movement throughout the day rather than sort of going to the gym for 20 minutes, and then being sedentary. So the opposite of exercising, obviously being sedentary, is one of the big risk factors for Alzheimer's and mental decline. So that's the fourth, where are we up to? That's the third pillar of the 6 pillars. And the fourth is to find ways to manage uncontrolled stress in your life. So the uncontrolled stress bit is actually the important component of this element of of improving your brain health and managing dementia, because uncontrolled stress, the neuroscience has shown that it's actually as almost in an equivalent way as damaging as excessive drinking of alcohol, in that it shrinks the parts of the brain, again, that are involved in memory and learning and are affected by Alzheimer's and dementia. So it's one of these, we all have a bit of stress in our lives. So a bit of stress is a good thing. There's actually good evidence that actually stressing your brain in that way and stressing your body is actually a good thing. But too much uncontrolled, out of control stress isn't. And if it's chronically elevated stress, can cause real problems for your brain health. And so I think if you'd asked me this 10 years ago, I didn't think I'd ever be saying what I'm about to say now in terms of the way you can manage this. But the neuroscience, which is what we always follow for the recommendations, actually suggests that meditation and mindfulness are actually really, really effective ways of managing your stress levels. So there's 100 different ways of doing these kinds of practices, and there's not really any evidence that one works any better than another. But the process of looking inwards and pulling yourself away from looking outwards and being driven by external factors like stress, in nature and with the support of sort of strong communities around you, is again, research proven to really help you manage this toxic thing for your brain, and that's uncontrolled stress.
Wow.
And the fifth element to improving your brain health for a healthy brain is, again, this is something we sort of take for granted, and it's something, and particularly in professional lives, that's often sacrificed when we're busy. and that's regular and restorative sleep. So people sort of often take sleep for granted. I think we all know when we have a bad night's sleep, you feel groggy in the morning, it can affect your mood and so on. But actually, sleep is is the kind of, it's almost the foundation of every other aspect of good health generally, but brain health specifically, because when you're sleep deprived, there's lots of good evidence now that actually, you end up reaching for unhealthy foods. You don't feel like exercising. You're less better at managing stress and so on. You're less better, you put on more weight. Your immune function is compromised. So it really has all these sort of secondary consequences for health generally and brain health specifically. But actually, there's a really good, and this is, again, it's all really very new research in the last 5 to 10 years. It's an active process. There's two things that why sleep is so important for your brain health generally, and just mental function, as throughout life, but midlife and beyond, and memory specifically. And the first reason is that when we sleep, that's when we lay down memories. That's when our memories, literally the memories from the day before or experiences of what we've experienced that day, are integrated into the memory centers in our brain and integrated with stored old long-term memories. That's one aspect to it. So when you're sleep deprived, you're interrupting that actual process, and that can lead to memory issues later in life. So that's very important. And, and the brain is literally rewiring itself while you're sleeping. It's this active process that's going on, and your brain is actually more active in lots of ways than it is during the day while you sleep. And the other process which happens, which is incredibly important for managing and preventing mental decline and dementia, is we have this active process. You can think of it almost like a sort of like the deep cleaning team that go to work in your brain overnight, that are literally all of the metabolic rubbish that's built up in your brain from the processing that's happened that day is washed away overnight while you sleep. So by some very specific kind of by the sort of glymphatic system in your brain. And this, we really only just started to understand this process very recently. And why this is so important is it turns out that this deep cleaning team are washing away, amongst many other metabolic waste, the proteins, the toxic proteins that are associated and of very likely cause Alzheimer's disease, are being washed away. So when you don't get your full complement of 7 to 8 hours sleep every night, not just day by day, but week by week, year by year, perhaps decade by decade, those proteins are now accumulating inside your brain. And that's the thing that ends up leading to that's the disease process. That's the thing that ends up leading to Alzheimer's disease and then manifest as the symptoms. And there's really, really good evidence that those two things go together. So, and often, when you see the disease process in an Alzheimer's brain, there's sleep deprivation as being part of that story. And there's some, to give you there's a couple of sort of, we often, as I sort of alluded to, particularly in the kind of working world, sometimes we're sort of, where there's almost a badge of honor of, I only need 5 hours sleep, or I only need 3 hours sleep, this kind of thing. And there's a couple of really good examples of famous examples of two people who famously could only survive on 4 to 5 hours sleep a night. And that's Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. And sadly, they both ended up with Alzheimer's disease. So obviously that's just an association, but there's lots and lots of examples like that. So sleep is the fifth one. And the final pillar, the final element of a healthy brain is actually, I think, what people go to when they think of, I've got memory problems. This is what I need to do to try and improve my memory. I'm worried that I can't remember a word, or I can't quite place that person's face, or, and those sort of things that we often worry about in midlife. And that is actually doing complex activities that challenge and engage your brains. So the different parts of your brain's capacities. And that also includes meaningful social interactions in your life, because that is a complex activity. So in this, when I talk about this, that people often, as I just alluded to then, people often think of brain games, or memory games, or Sudoku, or crosswords, or, puzzles, these sorts of things. And unfortunately, there's not actually that much scientific evidence that they do much for improving your memory and preventing mental decline, because largely they just work on a very kind of very, very specific and local areas of the brain.
Yeah.
And what we're trying to do here is activate diverse different parts of the brain. So the first thing to say is, if you've had if you're a lifelong learner, if you're someone who enjoys, that in itself is a huge kind of protection for the brain. And the process why these sort of activities, so the sort of activities, so complex activities at this time of like learning, and it's essentially comes down to something that's new, something that's challenging. So it's not doing the repetitive things that you do every day and again and again and again. Doing something challenging that's new, like learning a musical instrument, learning a new language, even doing things that put you outside your comfort zone of public speaking in situations where you're not doing that, working in local communities, doing new learning activities. And so the last thing I'd just say about it is that why that's important, and this is sort of, this concept is really what underlies everything that I've talked about in terms of the pillars of brain health, is the disease process is already there. And what you're trying to do is build up this buffer in your brain so that, there's 87 billion different neurons in your brain, a trillion, thousands of connections between them, trillions of connections, and the whole disease process is degrading that. So, and there's lots of different pathways and bridges in your brain to access the same information. And what you want is as many of those as you possibly can. So the ones that get degraded, you can still access that information. And this concept called cognitive reserve, which is this process of building up this buffer inside your brain, allows you to have these extra redundant brain pathways for accessing that memory via one particular route, because other routes have been damaged by the disease process. And all of the elements I've talked about here, all of the pillars, but particularly the last one in terms of doing complex activities that challenge and engage your brain, are the best way to build cognitive reserve. And that's the strongest evidence we have as a protective factor for slowing down, stopping mental decline and memory loss as you get older, and in the longer term, preventing Alzheimer's as well.
Yeah. And if I reflect on the people that I know who I view as having really successful retirements or successful later lives, they are doing all the things that you're saying. They're well, I don't know about their sleep because we don't generally talk about that, but I know that they are eating well, they're exercising, often, just on the community aspect, but they're part of something. So even economically, they are still taking part, whether they're doing charity work, whether they're actually still engaged in business, in commerce. They haven't actually retired as such to the point that the retirement is, we're sitting on the couch and occasionally we'll go to the beach or we'll go on holiday. It's not just the golf course. It is lots of things. Now, of course, golf, great on the basis that you're getting out people walking and, and moving around and moving their body. But the people who are still connected to stuff and are still doing things and actually really being fulfilled, I suppose, because they are part of something. And then by the very nature of that, I suppose that because if they're exercising and they're thinking about their health, they're eating relatively well, all these things are compounding, aren't they, as you say, to that point of, well, I'm not overweight, so I'm not pre-diabetic or diabetic. I'm keeping strong. I'm exercising. I'm part of something. I'm giving myself and because I'm being challenged around my work, in essence, maybe even if it's voluntary work, they probably wouldn't even call it work. But I've got one of my clients is an engineer in a steam train kind of organization, where they're building stuff and they're ordering parts, and another chap is involved in putting wells into different parts of Africa, and they're very much, it's a really active retirement rather than the classic sun-kissed beach and just walking down walking down along the sand and having a cocktail.
It's a great point. I mean, it's in both, sort of an active mind and an active body and a purpose-driven life. I mean, that would probably sum up those elements. It's so important. And I think of, historically, I guess, we often think of retirement as slowing down and, being less active and being less engaged in things. But something else that you mentioned there, which I forgot to mention, being socializing and being engaged in social groups is actually equivalent in terms of brain function to these complex activities that I was talking about, because it's challenging for your brain, even though you don't think of it as. Most of the time, if we're sociable and we're not introverted, we tend to think of those as quite enjoyable activities. But it's incredibly, challenging for your brain holding a conversation with multiple people and, engaging in those. So, even socializing in itself, because often, even socializing in itself is an incredibly good activity. Socializing in itself, whilst playing, a challenging game could perhaps be the most sort of optimal thing that you could do. But you're absolutely right. So purpose driven, still engaged in activities that they are the elements. And in lots of ways, as you've just sort of summarized them very nicely, it's sort of common sense, isn't it? In lots of ways. But sadly, in the modern world, I'm afraid, and that's why there is an epidemic coming, of Alzheimer's and dementia. We're not living our life in that way, not just in retirement, but earlier in life as well. But certainly in retirement as well.
Yeah. Now, Ben, I know that you have a huge amount of resources available to people to come and take a look at. And as mentioned, that test I did earlier, and you do courses and consultancy and all the rest of it. Tell me all about that. What can people hook into and how can they access your knowledge? So
we are sort of the way we engage with most of our audience is actually through a podcast and YouTube channel as well. So I do a weekly, like yourself, I do a weekly podcast on these issues. It's called Better Brain, Better You. And that's talking about everything brain health, but everything brain health related to kind of midlife in particular, so all the issues around, looking after your brain, but also other aspects of living in midlife as well. So we engage through our podcast, Better Brain, Better You. And we offer both courses and communities for people to sort of engage with our content. And that's courses that you can passively consume. So, that you can buy, video-based courses as well. And also sort of courses and coaching programs as well, courses of consultancy in which you can be taught in a group situation as well. And with myself, and my collaborators in a kind of group consultancy situation. And I suppose the final thing that we offer sort of one-to-one brain health consultancy as well. And that's often for people that are dealing with, specific brain issues, that need specific help that can't be addressed in a kind of more group situation. So our sort of flagship program, I guess, is, if you like, is where we have a dementia prevention program, which is a program that walks through these pillars and gives you, step by step exactly what you need. It's a 12-week program, 3-month program that gives you exactly what you need to have all of these elements in your life to improve your brain health and, in the end, to slow down cognitive decline and prevent dementia. And all of that's available at, I'm sure we'll link to them in the show notes, but at ologyonlinecourses.com.
Brilliant. Well, absolutely, we'll link to that. And as I say, I suggest everyone goes and takes that test. We'll put a link into that as well. That was very insightful. I'm glad to know that I came out as quite low.
Good.
So hopefully I answered the questions accurately. So I'll hold on to that for the time being. But, it's been fascinating listening to you, Ben. And, this is a key concern for all of us, whatever state of it or age we are as we progress forward. And even to the point of our loved ones who are maybe older than us, so that they have a successful, fulfilling later life and don't get and whatever they can do to prevent the ravages of dementia, as we go forward, is anything we can do to help anybody. Of course, that's a good thing. So thank you so much for your time, and really, really informative and kind of inspiring, really, how much we can do to help ourselves. So Dr. Ben Webb, thanks very much for your time.
Thanks so much for having me on, Justin. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you to Ben for taking the time to chat with me today about his great work into what keeps our brains healthy. Head over to the show notes on our website at theretirementcafe.co.uk for links to Ben's website, his podcast, YouTube channel, and all the other courses and resources he produces. As ever, I hope you've enjoyed this episode. If you have, please do leave us a review on your podcast player, as it really helps more people like you find us. You may know that I post all the episodes on my YouTube channel, which is Justin King MFP, for those who prefer to watch, so why not head there to subscribe so you never miss an episode. So until next time, I'm Justin King, helping you feel more informed in your retirement.